Good afternoon and welcome to Ask an Advocate with the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I'm your host, Lauren Duff, and today I'm very excited to be here to launch our new campaign, The Real Cost of Domestic Violence. The Real Cost of Domestic Violence is a campaign to raise the alarm about the dire need for more funding for domestic violence service providers in Pennsylvania. But beyond securing more funding in our state budget this year, we also hope with this campaign to shed light on some of the real financial, emotional, and physical consequences survivors of domestic violence, their families, and their communities experience. Today, we are privileged to be joined by our two guests, who are Deanna Dyer, our policy director here at PCADV, and Sywensky, the executive director at Turning Point of Lehigh Valley. As always, we welcome everyone to tuning in to join into the discussion by putting your own questions for our guests into the comments on Facebook for this video. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I would like to begin with asking you both, what would you say are some of the impacts or the real costs of domestic violence, both for survivors themselves, but also for our communities and for the Commonwealth as a whole?
Well, I'll jump in there, and thanks, Lauren. Yeah, I mean, I think as we've talked about this a little bit, I am in a role where I have been leading a domestic violence organization serving 2 counties in Pennsylvania, the Lehigh Valley, for about the past 8 years. And, we see consistently that, of course, for survivors, there are innumerable costs. And one of the things over the years where I've seen a positive improvement in the movement is we've really been trying to help take care of finding sources of funding to really help people meet the various needs they have. And it's impossible to say what specifically, but we know for an awful lot of people, leaving an abusive relationship at minimum involves a change in your housing situation. And back in the day, I think our movement really focused on providing very short-term shelter options for people to flee to, but we didn't have many resources to help people move on. And what we're seeing is that unfortunately led to a lot of people entering into the chronically homeless definition. It left people with a number of debts in their name. It really created a hole for people to dig out of. And of course, some people's needs financially aren't as extreme as others. But we find that for everybody, there's this real tangible cost in being able to access the services, being able to not just get actual money to help for rent, for medications, for new job skills and training, medical costs for your kids. I mean, the list goes on and on. I mean, not only do you have those types of costs, but even having the trained advocates who can go through the whole sort of web and maze of how do you access systems? How do you know what your rights are? There's an awful lot of things, and Deanna can speak to the various types of laws and policies that have been implemented to benefit people. But it's really a difficult thing to go through, especially if you're going through a traumatic event. So I think, that's where the agency costs come in, that we need this whole team of people who are trained, who are available. And one of the things, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in more detail, is, the biggest cost in most of our programs is people. It's those advocates, a lot of whom come to this work as survivors, many of whom have went on to get additional sort of college education or training, or sometimes they've grown with the program and have been with us 30 or 40 years, and this has been their professional and educational experience. But we typically are really undervaluing the work that people do, and for too many people, the choice to stay in this work is one between whether or not they can afford to do the basic things, like even live without government assistance, or leave this work and move into a private sector job. And it really is one of those things where every time that happens, it's a huge cost to the programs and the services available for survivors. So I'll just kind of leave it at that for now, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more. But Deanna, what would be your thoughts there?
I think you hit on so many good points, Lori. If I could just expand on a couple of them. First, your last point, and understanding that for domestic violence programs themselves, the biggest expense is their workforce, right? The staff. And I think that we would be remiss without acknowledging that many of the advocates who go into this work, myself included, are survivors ourselves. And so what it means when we are underpaying and undervaluing advocates who are doing this work, who bring their lived experience of their survivorhood into this space as well. So, a lot of other movements rely heavily on peer support, like the alcohol and rehabilitation space, substance rehabilitation, and domestic violence services are similar in that way, and that many of the advocates who work in shelters, who work in the transitional housing programs, who even work at the state level advocacy, national level advocacy organizations, bring their own lived experience of victimization and survivorhood as well. So I think that just adds another layer of the injustice that's felt when these programs aren't well funded to provide resources throughout the community.
I can just add a nuance to that. And I think one of the things I've also seen is where, one of the ways often nonprofits in general, so not even specific to this movement, but definitely in this movement, is you have so many people who are concerned and care, and they want to be able to be there for the work. And so sometimes the other way of handling these budget cuts or ways, when the funding is not coming into the program at the same levels, is agreeing to just wear more hats and work less hours, which often comes with losing benefits. It's, making positions part-time. It's kind of asking people to take on, services for the number of people that are just like unsustainable and honestly will burn people out. So I think that's one of the other things is that we talk about the economic cost. Can you afford to work? If you have to make a choice between, can I enroll my kids in Little League at this salary? Can I even put food on the table? But then there's also that really high mental cost of people who care so much that they often do so at sort of their own personal detriment. So, it kind of, I just, to add the extra cost, we're in a lot of ways often burning people out for really low wages. And they come to it because they really care. And that's always a big concern.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for those insights. And to, kind of continue the conversation for that. And Laura, I know you've begun to talk about this a little bit already and talking about, what advocates can do for survivors, but I was hoping that you could just give an overview of the types of services that Turning Point offer to survivors, what advocates do to help empower survivors, as well as some of the types of programs and services that you offer to the community as a whole, and some of the prevention work that you might do.
Sure. And, I assume that most, people who are here today are advocates who are involved with programs and they're going to be very familiar. But for anyone who's not in particular, we are a very proud member of the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And so we are one of, I believe, 59 programs today. I know the number changes a little bit, serving Pennsylvania. So, part of that, going back to the beginning, and a lot of programs are celebrating their 50th anniversaries this year. But, we all started grassroots. And we kind of grew up offering that same sort of array of services that are really intended to be client-centered, informed by empowerment, really, people helping people at the core. And so for us, what that meant was also taking part of that mission to make sure nobody had to go more than 50 miles from their home to flee an abusive relationship. So, in our area, our core service and what we always commit to is the emergency shelter for people fleeing immediate danger. And we've really, especially over the past couple of years, and anyone here who's been doing this work during the pandemic knows that became an increasingly hard thing to be able to do for a number of logistical and financial reasons. But I think, so at the core, shelter is not just a building. We say our safe house is a program, not a place. And it's really meant to sort of wrap people in supports 24/7, having an available trained advocate there. And a lot of times that person may also have to answer our 24-hour hotline. And for us, we get about 3,500 calls a year from people in crisis. So the same people, I say that safe house advocates, the shelter advocates of this work are just really the unsung heroes because they are often that first point of contact for someone reaching out for help. And they are likely doing it for less than livable wages and maybe answering that hotline call while they're also helping to attend to a house filled with people who have a whole lot of needs at the moment and maybe plunging a toilet at the same time. Like it is really, sort of impressive work they can do. in those programs, we're running, financial literacy classes. We're offering a myriad of sort of supportive group activities that people can participate in, everything from teaching people to cook if they want to come in and do that, or having more traditional support groups and kids activities. We offer, again, counseling. We call our counselors community advocates. They are available out in community locations to meet with people who maybe haven't accessed Safe House and don't need that 24-hour support. We have a team of legal advocates that are small but mighty, and they are in both of our courthouses primarily. In our region, about 2,200 people a year access protection from abuse orders or need help with those. So they are there primarily for that, but also helping with criminal justice system advocacy accompaniment when people are engaged with the legal system. They are also connected with a whole host of community partners who are helping provide some free legal guidance for certain situations. We have, I'm going to forget somebody here, our housing supports. As I mentioned, we know really, the amount of time people had to spend in shelter because they couldn't find a reasonable, safe, affordable housing option afterward has really been a challenge. So our team has grown significantly in the past couple of years as we've added in the housing advocates. And again, thanks to PCADV for their help with navigating HUD on that. But, we now have approximately 50 families in their own apartments, leased in their own names, that we're able to not just help them get, but also navigate all the challenges that come with trying to get an apartment when you don't have credit because it was wrecked by your abusive partner. Maybe you don't know the area, you're still trying to build your job skills or get on disability because you've become sort of in a position in your life where you can't work, often because of acquired brain injury or different things. We're doing a whole lot with kids. We know that we also really have to dedicate energy to working with our kiddos because especially those who are coming with their parents to get services are often, they're the ones who we have to spend the most time and attention with to really try to help them so we are not continuing this cycle decade after decade after decade and doing a whole lot of work in schools. And so, and then also focusing on special systems, legal systems, medical systems, and really try to get out the training, word. And I know for us, a lot of our efforts right now are focusing on workplaces where we're really trying to approach a lot of the companies that are in our region to do specialized training with, especially their HR and management teams on how they can become allies in this work, help recognize, respond, and refer employees who are experiencing this. And we know that there's also then the cost there, the real practical, tangible cost to workplaces when they have employees, valued employees who are experiencing domestic abuse. So that's sort of a whole lot of what we're doing, and in a lot of ways on a shoestring budget. And the irony of nonprofit, as we know, is the more we do, it just means we're doing with less, so unlike the corporate model where if you sell more, you get more revenue, it sort of works inversely for us. And so we ask our teams to do more and more, but, with the hope that we're going to be able to have somebody help support us in this work in our community.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. That is so much. And, kind of the type of answer I was expecting. And I think it just really demonstrates how much you all are doing for survivors, for your communities, the amount of different projects and initiatives and type of advocacy that you have going on. You're doing a lot with not a whole lot of resources. And so, we, of course, at PCADV appreciate the work that you and all of the programs are doing on the ground. And, we want to make sure that we're doing our best to help support that work. And so the next thing that I wanted to ask you both about, Lori, from your program, and Deanna, also what you've heard from the other programs in our coalition that you've been talking with, is what a lack of funding has meant for your local program, for advocates, for the communities and the survivors that they serve, and what would it mean if that funding continues to be flat and we don't see any real investment in domestic violence services?
Well, I think, Lori, if you want, I can start with sort of the federal and the state overview. I know here today we're primarily focusing on PCADV's priority budget request. So there's a line item in the state budget for domestic violence programs that PCADV's network of 59 domestic violence programs, including Lori's, rely heavily on. And that line item in the state budget has not seen a meaningful increase in half a decade. So what that means, and Lori, I'm sure can speak ad nauseam about, increased cost of doing business, with all of those things that she was talking about in terms of increased needs that survivors are presenting with, means exactly what Lori said. Programs are being expected to do more with less. Some of our colleagues in other states have talked about this in terms of, just to be able to provide level services means that level funding is not going to allow us to maintain that level service. Even that, sort of what we're providing now, we're not going to be able to provide tomorrow if there aren't meaningful investments in the state budget line item. And of course, member programs rely on lots of different, really creative braiding of different funding streams. And while the domestic violence line item in Pennsylvania state budget is a critical one, that exists against the backdrop of really a crisis at the federal level as well, where we're seeing historic cuts in the Victims of Crime Act funding, which a lot of our programs really heavily rely on as well. So, we're working with our federal and state partners to try to stop gap some of that crisis as well. So it's sort of, as one piece of the puzzle hits a downward spiral, it makes these other pieces of the puzzle even more important to sustain the services that are currently being provided. So without that meaningful investment in the domestic violence line item, programs are looking at layoffs, which means wait lists for survivors to be able to get access to the services that they need when they need them are going to grow longer. Programs are really experiencing a financial tipping point, which is threatening the ability for them to even keep their doors open, keep their lights on, that allow them to be able to, open their doors to survivors who are fleeing life-threatening violence in many instances. So this has got to be the year that Pennsylvania legislators step up and make that meaningful investment. The cost in terms of survivor lives and in terms of the economic burden to communities across the Commonwealth, it can't withstand missing another year and making this meaningful investment.
And I think that's important, from a numbers perspective, if you think about when you talk about the half a decade and looking at, the most significant increase was back around 2017. That was an additional $2 million. In 2019, I think an additional $1 million was put in. And again, that is helpful. It's never to minimize it, but it is against that backdrop that you talk about. And also just doing the math. I mean, there's 67 counties in Pennsylvania. So that $1 million, if you equally divided, would be about $15,000 per county in additional assistance. And when you look at an area like our region here, we have approximately 600,000 people in the Lehigh Valley. I mean, I'd like to say 15,000 is phenomenal, but what it means is that amount just doesn't keep pace with the other exorbitant costs. I have a fantastic board of directors that really tries to help us, manage our finances, which is helpful, and they're out hustling to find private contributions. I mean, that's, I think, the work we're all doing. It's what I think too many of us, who got into the work, we're trying to sort of, we're doing it for the mission as a survivor. That's also why I gravitated and chose this rather than doing some other stuff. But I think it's also, we spend so much of our time trying to look at how do we piece it all together. And again, that's part of it, but there's also the complexities of the state and federal funding. We spend an awful lot of time in the management. So the rules about what you have to do to get the money have increased and cost us more. So, our cost of just managing the money has gone up, not to mention since COVID, so the biggest factors there, costs went up significantly. We all know that. It's all over the news all the time. I think if you look at, sort of where we've increased our base rate of pay to be somewhat competitive, and we're starting to again lose ground, our base rate has gone up 25%. By contrast, since 2017, the PCADV funding's gone up 15%. So even just, we haven't got enough money to keep pace on the amount of money that we're paying people. And then all of our other costs went up, everything else, anyone who's had to build anything, get an accountant, do any of the things we have to do to manage the funds responsibly, knows those things have gone up significantly as well. So, and that's all, again, the VOCA things looming. So we all know about that, hopefully. But again, one of the things I think about is many of us are in communities that border other states. And we have been blessed where the Commission on Crime and Delinquency in Pennsylvania has managed our funds well. So if we're going to see big decreases, hopefully we are staving that off a little. So we all know we are getting somewhat of a decrease. And hopefully we're fingers crossed that will not be significant, but other states haven't managed it as well. And people do have family in multiple states they come across. So again, we're already feeling the impact for some states where they've had to decrease. I mean, our closest state is New Jersey, although an awful lot of people from New York, they live back and forth. And so we're getting an awful lot of people coming into our communities, into our program who aren't able to access services in the state at the same way they used to be. I mean, those are just some of the realities. And if the VOCA thing happens, we talk about it as the Titanic event. In that case, I think we'll start to see a real significant closure of programs across the country. And I really fear what that's going to mean for sort of survivors in our community. And at that point, it's not about how much can we cut back on the expenses of office supplies or how much can I ask people to realistically do without more money. It becomes, what services do we have to stop doing? Do we go back to the 1970s of we're a hotline and a shelter only? So I think those are just some of the real concerns we have. And of course, we do everything in our power not to get to that point. But there is only so much you can realistically do, as we all know, for managing our own houses. At some point you hit critical mass.
Yeah, Lori, I think in a previous conversation, you said something that really stuck with me about like I could never in a lifetime like reuse enough paper clips to make up for for the lack of resources that y'all are experiencing and that other programs are experiencing. And something else that struck me that when you were talking about before was how some advocates have even had to access the government benefits that they're helping survivors get access to. And when it comes to making investment in services, I mean, that really means that the government's subsidizing those services anyway, because they're providing benefits to folks because we can't just pay them. We can't just afford to pay them a living wage, which would just be better for everybody all around. So, hopefully this message will be heard that, the situation is really critical, and that this is important. And so on that note, I wanted to next ask just, why does this matter? Why should our listeners care about the real cost of domestic violence campaign? Why should legislators care about making this investment in domestic violence services?
I'll just say Deanna probably has this really eloquent answer, but I was going to say, what, it signifies it for me. We have somebody who has a local radio show that had invited me on. And so myself, one of the survivors that we have worked with and who now agrees to go out and speak about domestic abuse to kind of help others, we had gone on. And I remember at the beginning of the interview, he said, I don't know anyone personally. I just really support your cause. And got a hold of me a day or two after the interview saying how many people reached out to say, I never told you this, but. And so I think, if we think we know the numbers, we know the stats, 1 in 3, 1 in 4, we know that in some communities in particular that we've been able to make so much progress serving better. So we're really focusing on traditionally underserved communities. I think that, I fear we're going to lose a lot of that and the numbers aren't going down. I mean, that's the whole thing. And the more we talk about it, the more we are able to invest in prevention and community awareness, along with those, what I call the ER of services, our counseling, our hotline, the safe house. The more we talk about it, the more people come forward and get help. So when we talk about issues like mental health in this country, when we talk about people's physical health, there's a direct tie. People having the ability to go work because they're in a healthy relationship is tied to having services. Because for too many people, there aren't supports available. Maybe they come from a whole long family line where abusiveness was sort of going on. There's all kinds of things that happen. And so, I mean, I think if we are not there as supports, the other costs will ripple out significantly to communities. But Deanna, you probably have a very much more formal answer to that.
No, I think I would just echo a lot of what you just said, Lori. And, ultimately what we're talking about and why people should care is because at the end of the line is a life, right? And we know last year in Pennsylvania alone, 104 victims lost their lives to domestic violence. So, if
And in our community, one of them was a 16-year-old high school student, so this is not going away.
right. And we know that prevention is possible. But we also know that that requires an investment, right? Um, and there are lots of different ways that you can look at the issue, that will motivate you regardless of where your passion lies, to sort of connect the dots on why an investment here is beneficial to communities throughout Pennsylvania, to individual survivors, to our programs, to the nation. The CDC has a report that talks a lot about sort of the economic burden of intimate partner violence, and looking at the lifelong medical costs for a female survivor of intimate partner violence. It's like $103,000. So just think about, and that's just medical expenses. So $103,000 in a female victim's lifetime. So think about the economic burden of that on the healthcare system and the need for investing in healthcare resources. The workplace productivity loss is $1.3 trillion. These are huge numbers, right? So the CDC has named domestic violence the #1 public health crisis in the country, in part because the risk is so high, and the cost is so great. Just in criminal justice activities, there's a $73 billion cost. In victim property loss or other damage, we're looking at another $62 billion cost. The economic burden is estimated at $2.1 trillion. So regardless of what angle you're looking at, the real cost of domestic violence, whether it's in victims' lives that are lost, whether it's in, economic cost, healthcare cost, the cost to advocates' lives and well-being who have committed themselves to doing this work. There's lots of different ways that we can look at what is the real cost of domestic violence. And I've been increasingly talking about sort of my evolution of doing this work over nearly 2 decades, and increasingly it is becoming astoundingly clear to me that what survivors have been saying since my very first day as an advocate, at a district attorney's office, is what they really need is money and resources to keep themselves safe. If survivors had the resources that they needed to choose, to really have choice in what their safety plan looks like, they would be able to keep themselves safe. We know that economic self-sufficiency and financial independence is the #1 reason that survivors either can't escape an abusive relationship, or after they have bravely escaped that abusive relationship, they return to the abusive relationship because of a lack of economic self-sufficiency. When we're looking at lobbying for an $8 million increase in Pennsylvania's domestic violence line item in the state budget, and that's just to maintain the services that we're already providing. There's at least one program in Pennsylvania that has already started to do layoffs because of insufficient funding. Again, we talked about that's going to mean longer wait lists, survivors not getting access to the services they need to help them stay safe when they need those services. And in a 1-day snapshot where we surveyed programs across Pennsylvania in partnership with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, in 1 day alone, there were over 800 requests that survivors made that programs couldn't meet because of a lack of resources. And of those 800 requests, more than half of them, so I think it was like 427 of those requests, were for housing, unmet housing needs. So again, it comes back to, if those, I'm going to correct myself, it was 471 of those unmet requests were for housing. So, going back to what I said, if survivors had access to the resources that they needed to keep themselves safe, that's 471 victims that would have access to safe housing. That would be, so, I started my advocacy work in the DA's office, thinking that legal remedies were the solution. I went to law school, pursuing that same idea after representing survivors in court, realizing, oh, a caseload can only hold, so many cases. So let me go into policy work. And now that I'm in policy work, I'm thinking we don't need more policies. We just need resources so survivors can keep themselves safe. So that again, there's a lot of different funding streams that programs rely on to support survivors to keep themselves safe. And investing in the domestic violence line item is a particularly important one.
So if folks want to support this campaign, the Real Cost of Domestic Violence campaign, and our state budget advocacy this year, what can they do to get involved?
Sign our petition. Sign our petition. Please sign our petition. I think that will be available in the link in the chat. But that's the way that your voice can be amplified to the Pennsylvania General Assembly, and letting them know that you support funding for domestic violence services and for survivors to be able to get access to the services that they need when they need them.
Absolutely, yeah. And folks can also, oh, sorry, I was gonna say folks can also access the survey from our campaign page on our website. It's pcadv.org/real-cost. So you can find that on our website as well, or use the link that should be in the chat for folks to get to that.
I should mention in the campaign website, there's also a list of other substantive policies that we think sort of will help complement our core ask around funding. So things like allowing victims to terminate their lease early if they need to do that for their safety. We know that would support housing security for survivors. There's a bill that has to do with sealing certain eviction records so that survivors and those with certain eviction records have fair access to housing. So again, to support our priority around housing safety and security. So there's other substantive steps.
And I'll put a plug in there because from my area, there is also Representative McKenzie's bill recommending that unemployment allow domestic violence as an allowable reason to access. So again, I think that illustrates what you're talking about there is that, I think about this is one of those issues that it's not political in that traditional sense. This is really a purple issue. And so I think the purple is really our color here. I mean, it impacts everybody. Like honestly, domestic abuse doesn't discriminate. We see people from every walk of life. We see needs that are so diverse. And I think it's something that honestly, I think everybody can really understand and get behind. And so that's where I think these bills, they're common sense bills. I think if you haven't checked them out as an advocate, go check them out. I know a lot of programs are planning to participate along with Deanna and Lauren in the lobby day stuff, signing the petition, getting it out to your community, because people care. We sometimes can be the gatekeepers in this where we get access to this information. Are we sharing it out? Do the people in the community know just how precarious right now some of the funding is? And what they can do to kind of help us in whatever way they can through their support of this.
And community members can also always donate or volunteer at their local domestic violence program as well. Something you said made me think of that, the Give for DV campaign around Giving Tuesday is everyone knows someone, right? It's really not a partisan issue. In fact, we have support for our budget increase from all 4 caucuses, from Republicans and Democrats alike in both the House and Senate chambers this year. So it's really a bipartisan issue. Everyone knows someone, and there's a way for everybody to step in and help, whether that's through donating, through signing the petition. You can always reach out to your local elected representatives and let them know that you signed the petition and that you support increased funding for domestic violence services. So there's lots of ways that you can get involved.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for joining today. I did just want to uplift one of the comments that we had in the chat from a survivor who mentioned, there's also survivors out there who have left, but might have like permanent physical damage from the abuse that they have, that they've endured. And just want to uplift their experience and how that just shows that abuse affects folks in a lot of different ways and has really lasting impacts for survivors that they're then left to manage and deal with. And no matter how long ago the abuse has happened, you can always reach out to a program. You don't have to be currently in an abusive situation to reach out to your local program to get help if you need counseling or to figure out what resources might be available to you. Even if it was years ago, you can still reach out for help to the hotline, to your local programs. So we encourage folks to do that, even if they're not still necessarily in like the midst of that abusive situation, but you're still feeling those impacts, which, thank you for sharing your experience. And I just wanted to uplift that comment. So,
And Lauren, based on that real quick, if I could also mention
yeah.
just the Victims Compensation Assistance Program. So knowing, and I'm sorry, I can't see the comments, but if there are survivors, and again, depending on the situation, and how long ago it happened, but advocates, that's another thing that we can help people do. So again, in addition to some of the stuff we're talking about today, there is victims compensation assistance, which in some cases can help. But again, it's one of those many types of benefits and just a listening ear. I think all of our programs, we have people who sometimes they haven't talked to anybody for 10 or 20 years about what they went through. So again, that, reinforcing that need that we're here, not just for people who are fleeing today, but also maybe they didn't even realize it was abuse. And so, being able to be there today and help them in their journey to continue growing, I think is really critical.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Lori. Any final thoughts from either of you before we close out for today?
I just want to echo gratitude for survivors in the chat sharing their experience, and invite them and everyone to sign the petition.
Absolutely. And I just thank you for doing this. I think it's important and really sort of, again, the idea of this is a coalition by advocates, by survivors, really to kind of make sure that we are there for the next generation, So again, in the interest of being the torchbearers and wanting to make sure that people who need this type of service in 10 or 20 years can access it, I really appreciate your efforts around it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much for your time today. It's really important that we elevate this issue and let people know that there's a need out there for an investment into domestic violence services. And I also invite folks to not only to sign the petition, but if you are in Harrisburg on May 7th, we will be at the state capitol for